Okay. My name is Louisa Sack. I'm Politico's editorial director, and I am so pleased to welcome you tonight to this incredible space at Shea Chicago. This is an evening of cocktails and conversation on the future of social action. This evening is part of a nationwide series that we're doing entitled Generation Next. The Millennial Generation, Changing Social Activism, the series in Washington, D.C. with a deep dive on the future of work and the gig economy. And later this fall, we'll travel to Houston to talk about global citizenship, and we'll go to San Francisco to talk about communication. But tonight, we're looking at social action, and it's hard to think of any area on which the millennial generation has left a bigger mark. I was going to open this event tonight by asking who here has a Facebook or Twitter or an Instagram account, but obviously it's safe to bet that everybody does. And everyone has taken an ice bucket challenge, and you've all either liked a video of Hillary doing the whip and nay-nay, or you've retweeted a link to Jeb's Facebook page. But while doing these things might make us feel good, do they actually work? And tonight we'll debate whether your most obnoxious Facebook friend, the one who inundates your news feed with all his political beliefs, is an activist or merely a slacktivist. So we'll ask, how does Black Lives Matter compare to the civil rights movement of the 1960s? And what will it take to get millennials off their Facebook page and into the halls of government? So we'll hear tonight from two groups of people who are leaving their mark on our world. The first is a panel of leaders from movements such as Black Lives Matter, the fight for marriage equality, the Dreamer movement, and the conservative movement. And they will discuss how they are changing the tactics, the strategies, and the culture of social action. And then we'll hear the insider perspective of two key people in Illinois politics, David Spielvogel from Mayor Emanuel's office and State Senator Christian Mitchell, who was the youngest elected in the State House back in 2013. The question we want to answer tonight: how has the millennial generation changed social action? And where are they taking us next? And I'd like to invite the viewers on our live stream, welcome, to follow our conversation at #PoliticalGenNext. And please tweet us your questions. We'll get them on the iPad. And I'd like to thank our amazing Politico events team for bringing us all together here tonight. And I'd like to thank especially our sponsor, Deloitte, for supporting this unique series of thought leadership and conversations around the country. So before we get started with the program, I'd like to thank Deloitte, and I'd like to introduce Byron Spruill, Vice Chairman and Chicago Managing Principal at Deloitte.
I don't know if I need that, or am I live? Absolutely. All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Good evening. And Louisa, thank you and Politico for this great opportunity to have yet another conversation about social action. Certainly from a Deloitte standpoint, we take that very seriously in terms of my role here in Chicago to lead our office. But 4,000 people strong, well, we really have to think day in and day out about being significant in our communities, but then also how do we best serve clients. And so a big thank you for allowing us to be part of this conversation. We've got a great group of panelists, and I just want to real quickly just welcome everybody to the conversation. You know, from a Deloitte standpoint, we are so involved in our community. And from that perspective, we think about how millennials continue to impact us. We're 50% of our workforce right now are millennials. And going forward, obviously that number grows, but we're thinking of 75% of a global workforce being millennials. So you are definitely having an impact. And so how do we really make sure you're engaged? You're already making decisions that are impacting our office design, the way we do performance management, the way we think about our day-to-day activities. And then certainly you bring to us the whole idea of purpose and culture. And so even on your seats, you'll see where we've been studying this topic for quite a while now globally. And we have an annual survey out that year after year, it continues to tell us that you really care, millennials really care about purpose and impact. We try to live that day to day in our communities through Impact Day and being on corporate boards, et cetera, but you really are raising the game and telling us that we need to do better, we need to do more. And so I'm looking forward to the conversation tonight. We have a great lineup for you, and certainly take it all in, but then we're always going to be asking the question, what's next? What can we do to continue to raise the game in social action? So that's the technology side of it as well as the purpose side of it. So thank you for being here tonight, engaging in the conversation, and back to Louisa.
Thank you. Do you want me to keep sitting? All right, I'll keep sitting. So thank you so much for your partnership, Byron. We wouldn't be able to do this without it. So I'd like to remind you all again to tweet your questions to #PoliticoGenNext, and we'll be tracking those on stage. And you might see your tweet come up on these screens that we have. And a quick reminder, there will be more cocktails served after the conversation, so be sure to stick around, it's the best part. So without further delay, I'd like to welcome to the stage Anna Palmer, Senior Washington Correspondent at Politico.
Well, guys, I'm very excited to be here in Chicago discussing how the millennial generation is transforming the culture and technology of making a difference. Without further delay, I want to invite our incredible panel that we have to come up here so we can get this discussion started. Okay, so I will do the introductions first. Erica Andiola directs the Dream Action Coalition, which advocates for undocumented immigrants. Erica stopped her own mother's deportation with a viral YouTube video. Next to her, we have Andrew Clark, is the recently appointed president of Generation Opportunity, the Koch brothers' arm for political outreach to millennials. He engages young people on issues ranging from the gig economy to the criminal justice reform. Next to him, we have Anastasia Koo, is the Chief Marketing Officer for the Human Rights Campaign. She conceived and implemented her award-winning Red Equals sign social media campaign while the Supreme Court heard the historic marriage equality case. And we have DeRay McKesson. In 2014, DeRay drove to Ferguson, Missouri and informed the world of the riots through his Twitter account. He quit his job as a school administrator, worked with Black Lives Matter, and created We the Protesters. He now tweets about racial inequality to more than 200,000 followers. All right, let's jump right in. I want to start with you, DeRay, closest to me, so you get to be in the line of action first. The LA Times, Forbes, and others have anointed you one of the new civil rights leaders of the 21st century. But your effort has also been belittled as #activism. How do you compare the effectiveness of social media campaigns to the sit-ins and the civil rights marches of the 1960s?
Yeah, so Twitter for us has been an incredible organizing tool as much as it's been a way for us to tell a different story. So you think about Missouri last August and Ferguson, they would have convinced you that we did not exist if we had not been able to push back on these narratives. In Blackness, we often face these issues of erasure, and it comes in two ways. One is either the story is never told or it's told by everybody but us. And in this moment, we became the unerased. So I'll never discount the power of storytelling. So many people thought police violence was sort of this abstract thing that didn't really happen. And because of social media, we were able to connect these stories. And you're like, that happened to me too. You know, in St. Louis, the police have killed 9 people since August. As of today, the police have killed over 900 people this year in all states but 3, and every day but 9 days.
But all of us have Twitter accounts, right? I mean, if you think of most people, and I'm sure in this room have a Twitter account, how did you get that to manifest itself? Was it just kind of having more and more people actually retweeting you or getting information out there, or were you tweeting at journalists?
Yeah, I think some of it was just telling a story differently, and then we were there, right? So the reporters, I could get in rooms the reporters would never be allowed in. So I had 800 followers last August. I have about 230,000 now. And it was a lot of we could just tell the truth of what was happening on the ground in a way that CNN couldn't get to. You know, people say that the media made us something, and what I say to them is that the absence of the media is what made us something.
What do you mean that CNN couldn't get to? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so if you remember those days, people were standing in front of the CNN cameras being like, you aren't welcome here, right? But I was a protester, so I could go to every meeting, I could be in anybody's house. I think about the nights that I had to hide under my steering wheel because the SWAT cars were going down the street, and that wasn't CNN's story, right? They were afraid, they were running from the police like we were, they weren't telling the story. So many of us became storytellers because nobody else was telling it, and I say that was true of St. Louis, but it's also been true of the protests in all the other cities as well.
Interesting. Well, that's a great segue to Erica's story. So, Erica, tell us the story. It's an amazing story of how you use social media to actually stop the in-progress deportation of your own mother. It's amazing.
Yeah, so, I mean, just sort of as background, you know, we've been organizing with the Dreamer movement for quite a while, for about 6-7 years. And, you know, it was basically a tool that we were able to use to stop a lot of deportations from Dreamers, right? You guys have heard sort of the narrative, right? Like, Dreamers are these young people who have gone to college, who have graduated from high school, they're undocumented, yet they're not given that opportunity to be here and be citizens, right, to this country. And so we were able to use social media to be able to tell that story of, like, listen, you know, there's someone in Chicago is getting deported. Start calling ICE, you know, tell them not to deport him. Someone in Arizona, someone in New York. And so that gave us sort of this, you know, it's like it was mentioned before, sort of this way to tell that story that nobody was telling. And so for me, I was involved. I was able to, you know, go into communities organized, but I never really thought that it was going to happen to me, that I was going to have ICE literally knock on my door, ask me for my own mother, and, you know, end up literally taking her and handcuffing her in front of me and my little brother, and taking her and my brother. And so once that happened, I literally went to YouTube and I told everybody, you know, on YouTube, like, this is happening. ICE just came to my house. It took my mom. It's not okay. she's a 58-year-old woman. She has done nothing wrong. Please help me. You know, tweet, call ICE, do anything you can to stop my mom's deportation. And it worked. It was about, you know, in less than 12 hours, we had more than 50,000 people watch the YouTube video, tweet, call, send emails, anything possible to immigration. And thank God we were able to turn the bus around that was taking my mom to Mexico, and they came back to drop her off in Phoenix.
And you said they were actually watching your video in the detention center. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so my brother is fully bilingual, and he was also there with my mom, and he was able to see ICE basically processing them both. And at some point, you can see their desk through the cells that they have in the detentions in the holding center. And yeah, my brother was watching them laughing at my YouTube video. And they told my brother, you know, tell your sister to stop. She's not going to protect your mom. Nothing's going to happen. Your mom's going to get deported. She's not supposed to be here. She's an illegal, right? That's how they would call us. And guess what? ICE called, you know, from DC called Phoenix, and they said she's not supposed to get deported. Get her back. And she returned.
That's an amazing story.
Can you talk about that kind of situation where you all of a sudden kind of create this moment, right, where you talked on YouTube video? And Stacey, maybe you could talk, you know, you were so instrumental with the successful Red Equals Sign campaign in 2013, and kind of more broadly, more recently, the hashtag Love is Love. Walk us through that process. I mean, this was kind of something that was very from the ground up, but you're coming from a human rights campaign, a very large organization. How did these types of campaigns, you know, get started? What's the process and the thinking that, you know, how you can create something that's viral?
Well, that's the question everybody likes to ask me. How do I get this to go viral? And really, for us, it's about having conversations and changing hearts and minds to the side of equality. I mean, that is the work that we do day in and day out. And, you know, how we approach any situation is that we're highly entrepreneurial, highly engaged on social, and we really go to where conversations are happening. And in 2013, the conversation was really around marriage equality when the Supreme Court was hearing not one but two cases on the issue. And, you know, the Red Equal sign was just one component of our larger campaign to continue that national drumbeat on the issue of marriage. And, you know, the Red Equal sign was, you know, part of our digital strategy to engage and really to give people something to do online to show their support. And more than 10 million people changed their profile picture to our logo, which was tinted red, which for us is the color of love and really what those cases symbolized. But I think out of it, you know, I wanted to pick up on something that you had asked earlier about. The critique that we had was that it was just hashtag activism. And I think I wholeheartedly dispute that, because really, what we're doing is helping people have conversations. And at one point, those conversations were happening, face to face. And that's just no longer the case. I mean, they're just happening, we are interconnected in a way that we were never before. And so, the critique that it's just hashtag activism, my response to that is that, what we're really doing, what so many of us up here are doing is we're having conversations about changing culture. And that's happening in a really robust digital way. And I think that, the red equal sign was just an example of that.
In terms of that, I mean, you've been doing this for a long time in this work and in this area. I mean, when was there a shift in that? I mean, do you think that's over the last couple of years, or have you seen this, kind of conversation go from the face-to-face or over the phone?
Well, I would say, I think, coming from sort of a larger organization, it took us some time. I mean, that is like the power of social. It's now. Like, you can't wait 24 hours because that conversation is over and 10 other conversations have happened. I mean, you really have to be engaged in it in a way that I think, institutions have trouble making that shift. And so for us, it was so important to meet people where they are. And increasingly, we just saw that happening on digital. And it was, imperative for us to be part of those conversations. And so that's why, as part of our communication strategy, digital is not an afterthought. Digital is, first and foremost in how we communicate with our audience to make change.
But Anastasia, why does that matter? If 10 of my friends change their picture on Facebook to red equals, what is that doing? What is the function there?
Well, in many cases it was, to show, for people to be able to show their support. But we heard from countless people across the country about what that meant to them. And I'll just give you, one of my favorite stories. The best example I think I can share with you is that we heard from a soldier from Arkansas, and you can imagine how hard it is to be gay in Arkansas and be in the military. And he had come out to his mother as gay, and the conversation hadn't gone well. And in fact, they hadn't spoken since he had come out to her. She was very conservative, and it was unfortunately a very hard conversation. And she changed her profile picture to the red logo. And he said that for the first time, he felt loved and supported for who he was. And I think that is one story out of many. We recently heard Facebook came out with a study this week that said, in the past year, the amount of people coming out online has more than doubled. And so it's not just just changing your profile picture. It's about sparking a conversation. And I think that's what happened.
It goes back to what DeRay was saying about things that we're not seeing, the sort of erasure, the visibility, right? In a way, that's really interesting.
And I think, the more conversations that happen, the more, it's amplified, the more it gives people the courage to stand up and, to stand up for what they believe in.
And you're not alone. Right?
Exactly. You're not alone.
You see that.
Completely.
So I want to turn to Andrew. So, this all sounds really good, but you're a data guy. You're a conservative, you're a libertarian, but you're a data guy.
I'm a nerd, you can just say that.
So I once asked Andrew, what do millennials respond to? What kind of ads, what kind of outreach? And his answer to me was nothing. So you have an interesting take on how Google has made this kind of thing harder. And can you talk a bit about that and how you respond to it?
Sure. It looks like there's a lot of millennials out here. This is great. I'm used to seeing a bunch of old white-haired folks, so glad to see you. Look, here's what I think is really interesting about our generation, at least I think so, is we're deeply cynical, and we ought to be. We're told that we ought to pay a massive portion of our paycheck every 2 weeks, every month, whatever it is you get paid, and that you're going to get back in return Social Security. Does anyone here actually believe you're going to see that? Not one hand in the entire room. Every one of you thinks you're being lied to by the United States government. Every one of you. Right? And because of that, you're cynical, and this is not alone. You've been told, go to college and you'll get a good paying job, right? You'll be the head of the class. How many people go to college, get a job, come out and have a tough time getting to work at McDonald's? And now you're $100,000 in debt. And if we went over this on issue after issue, our generation feels lied to, and they're cynical about it, and they ought to be, rightfully so. But they're so cynical that it goes down to even the smallest deals. So the deal I'll use is Crest toothpaste is what Google and Procter & Gamble were studying in particular. Crest goes out and runs an ad and says, hey, you should buy our toothpaste. Look at all these great scientific studies we've run. We've had all these guys with PhDs go in and say our toothpaste is the best. And what do? You go on Google and you're like, I don't care about the study. Crest is slanted, right? You go down, you find like Billy Bob from Arkansas, and he's like, this toothpaste is amazing. You're like, that's my toothpaste. This is how we operate now. So this has made the political discussion really fascinating, much more difficult. In fact, kind of thematically, it's interesting up here. Look, the world's changed, right? We're a much more technological deal, and the cultural impact of that is it's very individually centric now, which is what it always ought to have been as libertarian, at least I think so. But that changes the way we have to approach it and the way we have to have discussions. Politico and CNN no longer have the monopoly on the news. One guy with a camera phone does. That's the guy who drives the conversation now. The world's changed. We got to change our culture to be with that. So when it comes to politics, yeah, when you run big ads and TV ads, millennials kind of like, whatever, you're slanted. Bernie Sanders runs ads, Hillary Clinton, Marco Rubio. They don't care. Everyone has an agenda. They want to know what the actual truth is.
And you had an interesting thought about this. Like, how can you, as an issue organization, deal and respond to that cynicism?
Yeah, so I think you get to be one of two things. Either you get to be the first party that's out there just hitting and saying like, hey, this is right, this is wrong, good, bad, or ugly. Or if you're really nuanced, I think you get to be the third party validator. You get to be the person when they go online and they start Google searching and saying, hey, is this true or not? You get to be the person who's more objective and standing on the outside and saying, yes, this is good policy or this is bad policy, which is interesting.
I love that concept of the third party validator. Can you give us some examples of?
Sure. So the things I would look at are like Hasbro gummy bears. We'll use this because it's a fun example. If you guys know about these gummy bears, or Harborough, I can't remember how you say it. Harborough, there you go, thanks. The sugarless gummy bears, have you guys seen this online? All right, okay, so you go on Amazon, there's 1 million reviews about how these things will destroy your intestinal system. It doesn't matter that the company itself has gone on and refuted this over and over and over again and said, like, we promise there's nothing unique about sugarless gummy bears that destroy your innards. But every comment continues to be about that. Why? You got a bunch of third-party validators that are full of junk, but they're all out there talking about their 24-hour experience on the toilet. That's a third-party validator.
So it sounds like you're really talking about the messenger, right? I mean, like these campaigns maybe work because the messenger was valid versus maybe as a company or, third parties, other people that are in the discussion aren't actually seen as credible.
Yeah, I think particularly for our generation, we're just looking for people who are authentic. And I think we've been looking for that for a long time. And it's why when we look at candidates, guys like Ron Paul or Bernie Sanders are going well. When you poll about the issues, most people look at those candidates and say, I don't agree with those guys. Those guys are crazy. But if you ask about the people, they say, I believe he's telling the truth. And that authenticity bleeds through. And that's what I think we're hungry for. We're tired of being lied to. We just want to know what the truth is.
So I want to turn to you and talk about, we were just talking Bernie Sanders, presidential politics. One of the things kind of in taking this movement forward, you recently met with Hillary Clinton and Black Lives Matter was mentioned during the Democratic presidential debate. How do you sustain this momentum going forward and maintain dominance in such an oversaturated market of digital activation where, when Ferguson was happening, it was kind of the new thing that was, happening on Twitter?
Yeah, so we met with Bernie, we met with Hillary as well. Had interesting Twitter conversations with like Snowden and some other people. And Snowden is not Hillary or Bernie, and don't mess up my mention about that. But Twitter, the reach is real. I think the next step for the movement is like, how do we build a coalition that includes many people? I think that like when I travel around to places, people ask me like, what can I do? And I think the movement has actually been slow to respond to that question, even with celebrities. I talked to some people. I talked to some celebrities recently who were like, Derry, what can I do? And I think that the movement, we haven't yet figured that out in a coherent way. But in terms of the political space, I do think that we sort of manage a large part of, we can make news, right? We know that like, if I tweet something about the campaigns that either I'll get a call from the campaign or a reporter, right? One of those two things will happen and we know it. So we talk to the campaigns often. I think about the meeting with Bernie, he left when we meet with the candidates, we meet with them for an hour-ish, and then we meet with their staff alone. And in both the meetings with Bernie and Hillary, their staff knows that like what we say when we walk out the meeting matters. So we are sort of fighting about policy or reflecting on parts of the meeting, and that's been an interesting thing to be in. And also just managing the media because of Twitter. I think about like some of the headline in the newspaper when Walter Scott was killed in Charleston was like a crazy headline about child support or something, and we like tweeted the editor-in-chief like, we're embarrassed that you did this, and like in an hour they changed the headline, so like we've been able to use the space to push in that way. That's been really powerful.
And do you think, are there concrete things on Capitol Hill, for example, that you think you're going to be able to take this movement to get things done next Congress?
Yeah, so that's interesting. We just had a call with the White House the other day about the Sentencing and Corrections Reform Act, because they sort of want us to help out with that a little bit, which is interesting. So I think that might get some traction, but we are sort of nervous. They come to us, not just the White House, but we met with Booker's team, some other people, and they're like, this is a bipartisan effort. And we remind them that the war on drugs is also bipartisan. So that's like not necessarily like a
selling point.
Right, we're like, no.
But that's so interesting. What does the White House think you can do to help pass this legislation?
Well, I think that like some of what we do is like translate, right? So we can say like, we read it all, this section means this, we think this is actually going to be good for Black people. Or we can say like, this is really problematic, but we think this is less problematic, or like everybody don't vote for it, right? That there is a group of people who are listening to what we say in some ways.
So the White House, Barack Obama wants you to be his third-party validator.
I didn't say anything Barack Obama. No, we had a call with Valerie Jarrett and Roy Austin, and we've had a lot of conversations with them and other senators and stuff. I think there is this interest in like trying to figure out how we speak to this group of people, especially with the Democrats. They know, we said to Hillary, if you talk like you talked in this meeting, you'll never get elected, right? That like Black people just won't vote. And if Black people don't vote, you won't win, right?
What do you mean if you talk the way you talk?
We said to her often that she uses coded language, right? So I don't know, is urban the people who gentrified the neighborhood or the people who were there before, right? Like and people shouldn't have to guess where they fit into how you talk, right? And when she talks, it's often like, I'm like, Hillary, what was that, right? Like, is that me? Is that the other person? So, I think that is, and I see that after we met with her for 90 minutes, and we benefited from being able to say, like, I don't know what you mean, and then she explained it, but like not everybody's gonna have 90 minutes,
So have you met with any Republicans? Have you met with Andrew? He's working on criminal justice reform.
His Republicans are special. I'm trying to...
Can you define that? I got 90 minutes.
Andrew, you gonna invite DeRay over after this talk?
So publicly reach out to Rubio, interested to talk to Rubio and Carson. I think that would be an interesting conversation. And we're trying to meet with Reince over at the RNC.
Mm-hmm. Oh, Anastasia, so you've got this great Supreme Court victory. Mm-hmm. So what is next for your movement, and especially in terms of your role on social media strategy and building the movement? Is there more to be built here?
Well, in June, the Supreme Court came down with a historic decision that effectively made marriage equality the law of the land. A few months later, we had Kim Davis. And just because the Supreme Court ruled something, it didn't mean that they outlawed homophobia. It doesn't mean that, a trans woman of color isn't going to be killed just because of who she is, or that a kid isn't going to be bullied in school for being who he is or who he loves. And so, the work of our organization continues, not just here in the United States, but certainly abroad. The Human Rights Campaign is pushing for the Equality Act, which would essentially outlaw discrimination for the LGBT community. Our talking point is that, you could be married at 10 a.m., but in more than 30 states, you could be fired by 2 just because of who you are. And so that kind of discrimination.
Fit into that? Like, how are you going to strategize around that to engage millennials especially?
Well, I think, when the bill was introduced, I think, talking about bills isn't necessarily the most interesting thing, right? So you have to kind of find a way to make it palatable. And, that's our job moving forward. We are continuing to have that conversation online to educate people in those states and others about what the Equality Act could mean, and certainly to bring to that. I'm a big believer in the power of a third-party validator. We work a lot with YouTubers who, if you've read the studies, are more influential than most major celebrities as validators. And so really, it's continuing that conversation, letting kids know in Arkansas that they are not alone, that we continue to fight for them, continuing to push politicians to do the right thing. And social is one part of it, and certainly a big part, but the work is broad-based.
Eric, I want to ask you a question about we're talking about the movements and where they are in the process. Immigration reform is certainly stalled in Washington. What are you doing to make this a part of the 2016 kind of presidential debate? And are you able to engage millennials? How do you engage millennials to get this kind of the fire started on Capitol Hill again?
Yeah, I mean, we're in a pretty bad situation right now because Congress has been, for a while really playing around with this issue, right? The football. Both parties. It's been both Republicans and Democrats have been going back and forth. And I think for us right now, the majority of the sort of millennial movement that has arisen from this has been the Dreamer movement, right? Sort of the immigrant youth, because it's been a little bit tougher to get sort of our parents, and I was, I've shared this before. It's so much easier for us to say, let's jump on a call, let's share a Google Doc so we can figure out how to, put together, talking points, how do we go to the Hill and research these bills. But once we talk to our parents, right, there's a language barrier. Like, oh, how do I go to the Hill and talk to, I'm going to need my kids. I'm going to need you, Erica. I'm going to need, Angel, my brother. And so it's, I think the Dreamer movement has been sort of that phase that has driven this movement forward, which is great. However, I think one of the things that the setbacks is that a lot of times we don't have that sort of voice from our own parents. You don't have that, like, it's easier for people and politicians to say, and we criticize a lot of times Democrats for this because they use sort of the Dreamer narrative, right? Like, oh, you guys are great. And Republicans do too. You guys are amazing kids, but your parents, like, we need to send them back. Or, they broke the law. It's not okay that they did this. But it's so much harder for them to say it because, again, the language barrier, sometimes they don't know how to use Twitter. They don't know how to use Facebook. They don't know how to tell their own stories like we did. And so right now, I think some of the main issues, even though we can't get something comprehensive on in the Hill, in Congress, there's a lot of issues that we also need to work on. The fact that, there's tons of detention centers in this country that are filled with immigrants, that are filled with people of color. And these detention centers are actually giving money to both Republicans and Democrats. How do we fix that? How do we make sure that people of color are not being incarcerated? And there's steps that don't necessarily need Congress to do something. So it's always for us to get creative and figure out a way to get policies that are going to change the lives of our communities. And we're not necessarily having to wait for Congress to do them because we're going to be waiting for quite a while.
That's interesting. So this kind of is a segue to a question for Andrew. We talk a lot about the possibility of criminal justice reform legislation next year on the Hill. And you've told me about how millennials tend not to identify as partisans as much as previous generations. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what your data shows on that, but also then, is there room for some kind of millennial coming together on that issue?
Yeah, so many areas or so many ways I could take that. So I think that in the post-Citizens United era, it's actually been very beneficial for millennials because it's empowered financially a lot of outside groups like ours to have a stronger voice. So I think that partisanship, and I think most millennials have this same attitude, is a really bizarre concept, right? Like, you're a Republican, so therefore you line up with these 20 issues. I don't think there's anyone in this room that necessarily lines up with all the issues of the party that they identify with. And when we ask statistically, what we find is, it's almost 70% of millennials now don't identify with a party at all, and they shouldn't. Again, these are not there. They're just very arbitrary lines like, hey, we're going to pick this team, you're on that team, and I want my team to win, not yours. Well, when you're dealing with an issue like criminal justice reform, which is a really serious deal, right? We are incarcerating an insane amount of people in this country, completely destroying their lives. We're basically saying you're going to be destitute the rest of your life. And we're having that not because we're, trying to have serious policy discussions, but because, I want my team to win. And we're going to beat our chest on that one. It's not a good thing. So yeah, I think I'm encouraged with the fact that we could have criminal justice reform, and that's happening because groups like ours are getting engaged. And to Dre's point, you're getting a very non-traditional group, right? I'm the white guy here on stage talking about an issue that is by and large having the worst impact on African Americans and Hispanics. And we're passionate about it. We don't need to help the rich. They already have life pretty good. We need to help the poor, and this is a great enabling way to do it. And millennials are on the cutting edge of that, and it's a pretty exciting generation.
I'm going to call for a lightning round because I see the timer ticking down. I'd love to hear everyone in 1 or 2 sentences, how can we get more millennials who are not interested in government, very hard to get them into these lawmaking, decision-making roles. What can we do to make the government more interesting to millennials?
Better sound bites around the stories and more interesting sort of opening paragraphs and headlines for news stories, and on Twitter at least.
Well, that's in stories, but what about getting them to actually want to run or play a role, get past the
Twitter, I got
to become a decision maker?
I think that there's so many people who feel like the government has never served them well. And until somebody figures out how to tell that story better about here's actually the benefit of the government, I think that people will continue.
We need a story.
People, I think there's a better story to be told about what the government can do.
All right, what do you think, Anastasia?
I think, candidates who relate to millennials, candidates that speak to millennials' issues, I think sort of engaging in mediums that they feel comfortable with. I mean, I was really excited to see the Clinton campaign embrace Snapchat. I mean, I think it's finding people where they are and having those conversations with them on platforms that they're comfortable with.
Andrew?
The number one thing we can do is provide food, because it gets people to show up.
And cocktails.
It's all about the food and the cocktails too, yeah. But really showing up is the issue, right? What we do is separate from that. But if you show up and you engage on an issue, have a real conversation from the data standpoint, to your question earlier, that's what makes the difference, is people show up and have those conversations.
Better stories, live events. Erica?
Man, it's a tough question. I think it's also opening up the opportunities for more young people to be engaged in better positions. I mean, you can't just ask, a kid to go and canvass for you, for a political party or a campaign, but not necessarily drive him in and to say, what do you think? How should I engage your own generation? I don't think I've really heard that much from a lot of the candidates.
I'm going to leave it to Anna to ask the last lightning round question.
All right, so what are the new platforms, technologies, and techniques that you are embracing or you think are going to be on the forefront of where, the next generation of kind of reaching out to millennials is going to be?
I think Snapchat is a fascinating place to tell stories. I'm beholden to Twitter. I think it's a great platform. I think it's really text-based, and if text is not your thing, I think Snapchat is the next frontier.
I would say Snapchat. I mean, I'm also, as I mentioned before, just the power of the YouTube influencers. I mean, they're just huge and really sort of eclipse in terms of power and influence online.
Yep, I'll third that one. Snapchat by far is the biggest growth.
I had to ask my 19-year-old brother, because I'm also a little behind on Snapchat, and he's definitely Snapchat is going to be the thing. And some Instagram. Instagram is also getting there.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you all so much for your stories and your insights.